This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states and situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
What's 2FA security on Kraken? Let's say I'm captaining my soccer team, and we're up by a goal against, Soda Springs FC. Do we relax? No way. Time to create an extra line of defense and protect that lead. That's like 2FA on Kraken, a surefire way to keep what you already have, safe and sound. Go to Kraken.com and see what crypto can be. Not investment advice. Crypto trading involves risk of loss. Cryptocurrency services are provided to U.S. and U.S. territory customers by Payward Interactive Inc., PWI DBA Kraken. View PWI's disclosures at kraken.com/legal/disclosures.
On Friday, I called up our producer, Shayna Roth, who lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Hi, Shayna. How are you this morning?
I'm, hanging in there, Lizzie.
Shayna, of course, lives in a swing state. She's not registered with a party. So, to the various campaigns, she's a voter up for grabs. And I was wondering, as a Michigan voter, if you could pick up your phone and read me some of the text messages you've gotten lately.
So, for example, I have a very long one that has a really aggressive countdown, end of the month deadline. That one appears to be asking me for money. Hey, election day is next week. We're looking for voting ambassadors to talk to their friends about Kamala Harris, and Tim Harris is going to be in East Lansing on Sunday afternoon, asking me if I have plans. A up to $200 stipend. It's completely remote. Want to join? Stop to quit. A whole thread of ones from Alyssa Slotkin that go way back.
Oh my God, that's a lot of text. You're showing them to me.
It is a lot going back from that one. One that I got a few days ago, which was very odd, came with a picture of my supposed voting location. It says, if you're registered to vote at your address, records suggest that you may not have voted yet. This data could be out of date. And then it has what it thinks is my early voting location and then a picture of it, which initially I thought was like a picture taken from a car. But if I zoom in at the bottom, it's from Google Maps. I mean, I get at least 3 to 5 a day at this point.
Wow.
And that's just the text messages. That doesn't even get into what is going on in our mailbox right now.
Is this the most that you've ever gotten, or did you get a lot last cycle too?
I think this is the most. I really do. I don't remember this sheer volume attacking my phone like this before.
Today on the show, how and why political texting went insane. I'm Lizzie O'Leary, and you're listening to What Next TBD, a show about technology, power, and how the future will be determined. Stick around, or we might text you. This episode is brought to you by Public.com. Did you know you can lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at Public.com? The Federal Reserve recently announced a big rate cut, and there could be more rate cuts this year and in 2025 as well. That's good news if you're looking to buy a home, but it might not be so good for the interest you earn on your cash. So if you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade bonds, check out Public.com. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up. And once you lock in your yield, you can earn regular interest payments even as rates decline. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com/whatnext. But remember, your yield is not locked in until you invest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed, not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosures/bond-account for more info. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This month is all about gratitude, but there's one person we don't thank enough, ourselves. It's sometimes hard to remind ourselves that we're trying our best to make sense of everything. And in this world, that isn't easy. Practicing gratitude can improve your personal well-being, and you might find it beneficial to learn gratitude-building techniques from a therapist. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp can help you tackle life's challenges by providing accessible and affordable care. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. With BetterHelp, you can message a professional therapist anytime, anywhere. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. If something's interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals, they may be able to help. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/whatnext today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/whatnext. Back before our phones were constantly blowing up with political texts, campaigns tried a few different things to get out the vote. There was the tried and true door-to-door approach, phone banking and sending postcards, and blanketing the airwaves with TV ads, especially in those last few days before Election Day.
You can reach all these people simultaneously, and to be up on the airwaves, you don't need to do the traditional retail politics that they had been doing for a century or more.
That's Jacob Neiheisel, a political science professor at the University at Buffalo. One of the things he studies is how campaigns have changed over time.
And turns out that a lot of research in the last 20 years or so suggests that, ads have their place, but really go TV, get out the vote, ground game types of activities are really the best bang for your buck. And I think that is largely still true to this day, even in an era where campaigns are trying to do lots of different things to reach voters. I think a transitional period where you still have legacy media connecting with enough voters, typically older voters, that you still have over-the-air broadcast advertising being aired in places where you can find good voters, right? They're older voters, they're watching the nightly news, and you still need to be able to reach them. But at the same time, they're trying to figure out how to get to younger generations, which means things like text message campaigns. It means things like targeting through social media. It means, placing ads in video games, which is something that Barack Obama's campaign had done. So I think that the core lessons of that research are still there, even though we're trying to find sort of new technologies to reach voters.
Text outreach really exploded in the 2020 election for one simple reason: COVID. Campaigns pulled way back from in-person events, especially the Democrats.
Earlier this week, on the recommendation of officials, my campaign canceled election night rallies that we had planned to hold in Cleveland, Ohio. We're also reimagining the format for large crowd events we had planned in Chicago and Miami in the coming days.
So the Republicans did do more face-to-face contacting than Democrats did. But Democrats, if they were to stay on message that you should take this seriously, you should, keep in line with the health regulations and the best practices there, they have to figure out a way to run a campaign that doesn't involve a lot of face-to-face contact. The consultants I've talked to suggest that they really didn't see that much of a drop-off in contact rates and that much of a drop-off in efficacy of those contacts from using something like text. So I think they've continued to lean into it because it's easy, it's cost-effective, it's cheap, and it tends to work, particularly with younger demographics.
Yeah, I just unsubscribed my mother from 75 different political texts. So clearly there is some efficacy here.
Yes. Normally we think of these things as being effective at the margins, right? They're not having huge effects. The effect sizes really for almost anything a campaign can do hover in the mid-single digits, and that's on a good day, right? Huh. So we're not talking about massive changes in sentiment, massive changes in intended turnout, massive changes in persuasion. So much of what goes on in campaigns is sort of baked in from the get-go. It's the nature of the times. It's the state of the economy. It's voter fatigue with different political parties, right? Lots of these things that the campaigns can try to shape perceptions of, but for the most part, they're out of their control. And so what they do is throw lots of money at things that are in their control. And that involves contacting voters, putting paid media out there. And so they're going to put tons of money into whatever they can. And even if it's not moving the needle a ton, it still has the potential to be determinative in a really close race.
Well, how cheap is, say, sending a bunch of text messages, hey, Lizzie, don't forget to vote, compared to the traditional go to your local TV station and take out a 30-second spot?
I mean, the biggest costs for text messaging would be on the front end, getting access to the numbers, knowing who you're contacting. And that's oftentimes a matter of merging voter file data with commercial level information, right? Who are these people that we're contacting? And is this data curated in such a way that I'm ideally reaching the people that I want to be reaching? And so that ends up being the vast majority of the costs in terms of a text message campaign. And also there might be some costs in terms of personalization. The ones that I get, because I still have a Wisconsin phone number, so I have not escaped this either, are typically from, or at least geared to look like they're from a staffer. They're from somebody volunteering for the campaign. So, there is a little bit of cost put into the attempt at personalization, but for the most part, it's going to be on the front end versus, advertising in particularly very expensive media markets is, unbelievably expensive, or it can be for the campaigns, depending on where they're trying to air. And of course, in battleground states, those tend to be pretty expensive media markets.
How good is that data? I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot on this show is the granularity of the data that a Facebook, an Amazon, a very large platform has about you, your interests. Do campaigns and PACs have data at that granular a degree?
Oh, yes. So they typically start with a voter file, which, the laws surrounding it vary from state to state. Typically, they're made available for free or very cheap to the campaigns, particularly the major campaigns. There are some states that make it kind of cost prohibitive for third-party runs. But for the most part, if you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, particularly on the national stage, that ends up being, fairly costless to you, or at least not terribly so. And that's going to include voter history. It's going to include address, how often you vote. If you're a party registration state, it's going to have your party registration there. And so already off the bat, they know whether you're a good voter or not. And they're going to know, of course, where you live. Sometimes a phone number is in that voter file. Other information, depending on the state, could be there as well. And if it's a party registration state, they're going to know what you're registered as. And, it's not a perfect correspondence between registration and people's partisan identity, but it's really close. I mean, from that, they will go to private data firms that will append those data from the voter file to consumer data. They'll append it to census level data, past election results in terms of the voting patterns of the surrounding area that you live in. So it turns out that it might just be easier to persuade somebody who is kind of an island, right? If they're a Democrat in a largely Republican area, that's information you want to know because they're probably already getting a lot of social pressure and social cues to move in that direction anyways. So a little bit of nudge from a campaign can put them in that direction. They also love to see kind of divided households, right? Households that are divided, husband, wife, or partner, and they're living at the same address, but they're registered with different parties. Those might be people who are persuadable because they're getting cross-cutting messages throughout their daily lives.
It seems like, from what you're saying, that the potential for hyper-targeting is really there. And yet I also wonder, is that invasive? Do I run the risk of turning off a voter by giving them such a personalized message?
There is the potential for backlash effects. So one of the tactics, and this comes out of the political science literature, is basically like voter report cards. And so they tell you, here's how often you voted in the past. Here's how your closest neighbors, how often they vote in the past. And of course, it helps to say, well, your neighbors are voting at a higher rate than you are. What's your problem? That's not quite that blunt, but every time a local campaign trots out that tactic, which again has been shown to work in the literature, there are people who are upset, right? It feels invasive. We don't necessarily know how much of our information is out there. I think maybe we should at this point, but we don't necessarily know, particularly in the political arena, we think that it's a secret ballot and should be private. And it is a secret ballot. We don't know who people voted for, but it is public record that you voted. And so I think that feels invasive for a number of people. And even though the literature suggests that social pressure of that nature can work on average, some of the consultants I've talked to locally say that they avoid it because they do fear that backlash effect.
When we come back, does sending dozens of increasingly desperate political texts work? Have you heard about doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cashback earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is brought to you by Public.com. Did you know you can lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at Public.com? The Federal Reserve recently announced a big rate cut, and there could be more rate cuts this year and in 2025 as well. That's good news if you're looking to buy a home, but it might not be so good for the interest you earn on your cash. So if you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade bonds, check out Public.com. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up. And once you lock in your yield, you can earn regular interest payments even as rates decline. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com/whatnext. But remember, your yield is not locked in until you invest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed, not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosures/bond-account for more info. Have you heard about doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cashback earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. How good is this stuff? I mean, does it actually work to text someone, or is it just like, meh, it's cheap?
It's cheap, and there is some research suggesting that it works a little bit. Again, we're not talking about huge effects here. The vast majority of the difference in election outcomes can be explained with reference to these big factors that are really hard to move, right? We can try to change voters' perceptions of something like the economy, but it's still the case that the economy, measured and in some sort of objective way, seems to matter quite a bit, right? It's a nature of the times kind of argument. So, yeah, we're not talking about huge effects with any of this stuff, but campaigns, they have to do something, right? If they just sat back and didn't campaign and say, well, I'm just going to ride the wave here, I don't think anybody would think of them as rational political actors anymore. Even if that's ultimately what happens, right? They spend all this money and they were probably going to win anyways. And that's probably the vast majority of campaigns end up being, I do this because I feel like I have to do it, and I'm going to feel really, really dumb if I lose and I didn't put in a minimum level of work here. And so, we're not going to see campaigns not campaigning or candidates not doing that. But we're really not talking about a lot of movement here for the most part.
The amount of voter data that is available to a campaign or to a PAC, a super PAC, also has a decently high potential for disinformation and misinformation. In Pennsylvania, there's this one group, All Vote, accidentally sent voters a text message saying they'd already voted when they had not. That also feels like a world where, as you're saying, on the margins, if a small group is affected, that can move the needle.
Sure, absolutely. It's not an arena that is not without the potential for peril. That being said, it's one that is remarkably difficult to regulate at some level. Political speech, at least in the United States, is afforded an awful lot of leeway and an awful lot of freedom. And I don't know that that's a fact that people necessarily appreciate, right? There's things that it feels like they shouldn't be able to do. And yet consistently the courts have been reluctant to step in and say, here's what you can do in this arena and here's what you can't do. It's not that they can do anything, right? There are certainly boundaries, But for the most part, when it comes to the realm of misinformation and disinformation, unless you're, blatantly telling voters to stay home because of some crisis that doesn't exist, if you're telling little lies or even sometimes big lies, that still has some kind of protected status.
When you look at the academic research, is there anything that examines just the flood of electronic communication? Because I do wonder if at a certain point, getting 4, 5, 6, 7 texts every day turns voters off.
So there is some research out there on, particularly some of this goes back to the 1990s, with respect to the potential demobilizing effect of negative ads in particular, right? Can we be turned off by these campaign messages that we're seeing? And, at least in an experimental setting, there is some evidence to suggest that, yeah, some people can be turned off of the process, particularly if they see it as being nasty or overwhelming or too much.
Ads like the infamous Willie Horton commercial from the 1988 presidential campaign, aimed at Democratic candidate and Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Horton, who's Black, had been convicted of murder and got a weekend furlough through a Massachusetts state program.
Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
The couple Horton attacked was white, and so the ad played into racist stereotypes and stoked fear among white voters. And crucially, it wasn't made by the George H.W. Bush campaign, but a sympathetic outside group.
And there's a reason why that ad and some of the worst ads you'll ever see are run by outside groups. And that's to give the campaigns themselves some measure of distance from them, at least plausible deniability. There are salient examples that we can point to suggest that there's the potential for a backlash effect here. And there might even be the potential for something like diminishing returns, right? The 10th ad matters, the 11th ad maybe matters, the 12th ad doesn't do a thing. Or maybe even things start to turn in the other direction. That being said, I think most campaigns would rather hit you with too much than not enough. And that's largely because we know that media effects decay, and they decay pretty quickly. There's been a number of studies trying to kind of pinpoint what the time period is, and it's on the order of 2 to 3 weeks. We can remember a message that we received for that time period. It seems to shape our behavior, but after that, it's gone, right? It might as well not have even been aired. And so the campaign would rather hit somebody who's really plugged in, right? Somebody who's watching all forms of media with too much than miss that person who's only tuned in to a few platforms ever so briefly.
Why are these messages so unhinged? Why do people make these things like, is this a message from the Democrats or is this my ex, who wants me to call them?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a couple answers that we could level there. One is, it might just be a reflection of where we are as a body politic and as a society. Our politics are so polarized right now that that's the norm, right? We're used to kind of a smash mouth politics right now like we didn't used to be. And I think that there's almost a demand for it in some ways. We don't like to think that there's a demand for it. We don't like to think that about ourselves. But we're simple creatures in some respects. And, we still crane our neck at a car wreck. We know we shouldn't do it. We know it's not right. And we know that, whoever's there is having a really bad day, but we still want to see what's going on. And I think that impulse is very much active in our politics in some ways. And it's also the case that more negativity, more over-the-top stuff tends to stick. It tends to be the things that we remember. There's more usable information there than positive or even more policy-driven aspects of a campaign.
So if you have a phone from Wisconsin or Michigan, sorry, that's just the way it's going to be?
It's coming. I think I gave an interview some number of years back, and they asked me what my advice was, and I said, I don't know that it's go off the grid during election season, but it's going to have to be pretty close to that.
Jacob Neiheisel, thank you so much for talking with me.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Jacob Neiheisel is an associate professor at the University at Buffalo, where he studies American politics. And that is it for our show today. What Next TBD is produced by Evan Campbell, Patrick Fort, Shayna Roth, and Alyssa Jung Perry. Our show is edited by Paige Osborne. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio for Slate, and TBD is part of the larger What Next family. And if you like what you heard today, the single best way to support our show is to join Slate Plus. You get all your Slate podcasts ad-free. All right, we'll be back next week with more episodes. I'm Lizzie O'Leary. Thanks for listening.
We all have that friend who wakes up early to go get everyone McDonald's breakfast, while the rest of us sleep in. This is your sign to thank them. And if you're that friend, this is us saying thank you.
Just a friendly reminder that right now, get any size iced coffee before 11 a.m. for just 99 cents. And a satisfying sausage McMuffin with egg is just $2.79. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.